Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here. It's quite an honor, in fact. And I have been tasked by the Atlantic Council to do a report on renewables in the region. And it was a very interesting report to write. Perhaps I have to preface my short remarks today by the fact that I have been following development in the Gulf since I first arrived in the Gulf in December 1974. So things have changed a little bit since then. I'm sure a few of you may know that. I arrived in Saudi Arabia in 1974, and I've seen the enormous development that has taken place there. I lived in the Gulf for 10 years, then I went back to the States, and I covered the Gulf from the States. So I've traveled extensively since. So I have actually seen how mind-boggling the changes have been, and that has made me somewhat optimistic, much more optimistic than most people oftentimes are about the Gulf. So let me just start by saying that we have chosen a certain photograph for the report here. It's not the best photograph ever taken or ever presented in a report, but the reason we chose this photograph is because it really summarizes my report rather well, I thought. We see here in the photograph His Excellency Sultan Ahmed Al-Jaber pointing to Hillary Clinton and to the US ambassador some details of the CSP tower of Masdar. And I think that is really what I'm trying to say. The Gulf states, as they are today, with relatively quite little renewables, should become not just adopters of renewables, but leaders. And this is why the pointing by His Excellency, I think, is very important. It should become leaders in renewables and then show what they can do and will do to the world. In other words, I think the Gulf should aim to become as dominant in renewables as they are today in oil and gas. The report itself gives a fair amount of details about what the countries in the region and in the Middle East in general have done in renewables. In fact, it's very small. And I would urge you to look at all the reports of IRENA. IRENA has done a fabulous job covering renewables out of Abu Dhabi, and a lot of the information I have in my report really comes from there. But the total installed capacity in the Gulf Cooperation Council alone is only 280 megawatts of solar and CSP, mostly. The plants are still small, but the plants are pretty big, and we will see how this develops over the time, but the UAE alone has plans to develop 13 gigawatts of energy, renewable energy. Of course, a lot of this is from the 4 nuclear plants that are going to come on stream in a couple of years. But they have 1.2 gigawatts of solar power and in photovoltaic cells, and about 800 megawatts in CSPs coming forward on that. The Saudi, of course, Saudi Arabia is right after, or a little bit further than the UAE in terms of renewables. It has only 48 megawatts today of power generation and only 1 wind turbine. So, but they have plans to go to 3.45 gigawatts of solar by 2020 and up to 9.5 gigawatts by 2023. So they have a very ambitious plan, and they actually cut down their plans quite substantially, because originally, as part of these renewable efforts, they were going to build something like 16 nuclear plants, but they've reduced that to only 2 nuclear plants. But I do not include the nuclear plants in this report by and large. Other countries in the Middle East have done very well. Of course, some of them have a fair amount of renewable already. I mean, Egypt, for instance, already has 3.7 gigawatts of of renewable, but mostly because they have the Aswan Dam, which is one of the largest in the world. Jordan, excuse me, Jordan has already 500 megawatts of capacity today and has 700 megawatts in plants being built as we speak. One of the greatest success, of course, has been Morocco. Morocco has 3 gigawatts of existing wind power mostly. They have some solar as well. So that has done very, very well here. And we'll see how that develops further, but I'm sorry, I'm looking for my notes here. Here we are. The main issue, really, that I'd like to point out is that it's not just building plants, it's also the organization of the building of the plants. The institutionalization of this development is actually quite interesting. Saudi Arabia today has a new state organization under the Ministry of Energy called the Renewable Energy Project Development Office. This is in charge of doing large-scale renewable. It also, more importantly, is doing extensive research in various organizations. They have CAPSARC, they also have the King Abdullah University. They have some efforts done in projects research at the King Abdulaziz Center for Science and Technology. Here in this country, Masdar is involved, is doing a lot of research within the UAE. They have a large research center within Masdar city, but they also are very active outside the UAE in CSPs, winds and power and photovoltaic in Jordan, Egypt, UK even, they have a venture in the UK, in Serbia, in Mauritania, in Afghanistan, in Morocco, even in the Seychelles. So they're not just trying to develop renewables in this country, but they're going pretty much worldwide. Another interesting factor which I discovered during this research was that there is also a fair amount of involvement by the private sector. In Saudi Arabia in particular, there is a company called ACWA, ACWA, which installs power and water plants worldwide. They have now 6 gigawatts of management and construction and management worldwide. They have a division that specializes in renewables, and they have won bids for their solar projects in Jordan at about 6 cents per kilowatt on 2 plants of 16 megawatts each. So they are involved all over the world, and there are even other private firms that are involved, which we don't talk about very much. One of the largest merchant families in Saudi Arabia, the Al Jamil Group, which are they are the agents for Toyota, among other things, but they are involved in solar projects, and they invest in solar projects and build them worldwide. They're in the UAE, in India, in Uganda, in South America, all over the place. These points are basically precursors of what could happen in the Gulf. It seems to me that the private firms in the Gulf and the state firms like Masdar could become not only installers, but manufacturers and, more importantly, designers of new technology. That's how they can become the leaders in their fields. And the parallel I'm trying to make in this paper really is that in the past, the UAE and Saudi Arabia learned the technologies and became leaders in the technologies. In oil, Saudi Aramco, 50 years ago did not know anything, but then Saudi Aramco became one of the leaders of the oil companies in the world, and they are one of the dominant companies in the world. But not only in oil, chemicals, SABIC today, the chemical company of Saudi Arabia, is the largest chemical company in terms of capital in the world and the 5th largest in terms of sales. So they have themselves started from nothing in 1980 or so and become a dominant power in chemicals. And there's absolutely no reason why the same thing cannot happen in renewables. This will give the countries of the region the ability to withstand any kind of decline in the oil needs of the world. This may not happen very shortly, but they have 30, 40 years to learn to become as dominant today in oil, in renewables, as they have become in oil. So I think I will just leave it at that, but what needs to be done here for this to happen is to have the countries continue to develop their research extensively, invest greatly into manufacturing, installing at home and worldwide. This implies a lot of investments locally, but also to learn the technology, as SABIC has done in many cases, by the companies worldwide that have the technology, bring the technology here, start manufacturing or manufacture overseas if necessary, and become dominant in this field. So that's what I would like to give you the chance and opportunity to read in this report. I'm very honored, actually, to introduce Her Excellency Fatima Al-Fura Al-Shamsi, who is the Assistant Undersecretary for Electricity and Future Energy Affairs at the Ministry of Energy in the UAE. So, Your Excellency.
Thank you for introducing me, and thank you for this insightful report on the renewable future in the region. I'm honored here to have this panel discussion, to moderate the panel discussion on the investment as the future as analyzed by this report. We plan within the region for the renewable and increase the share of renewable is there. I was discussing with one of the panelists. Yeah, we are doing a lot of planning. We hope that we will achieve our targets, but the question will be how to utilize this solar, reduce the renewable and reduce this curtailment of this. Definitely, there is another direction or it's not a new, but we need to focus on electrification of other sectors such as transport, buildings, heating in other countries. So to do this, again, we have done a great, I think, at least in our country, with regard to investment and financing costs for renewable, but additional is the financing of other electrification aspect of the sector. So let me introduce our panelists. Dr. Orban Rosnak, Secretary General of Energy Charter. Jason Bloom, Director, Global Market Strategy from Power Shares by Invesco. Aida Stedikova, Director of Energy and Natural Resource, Russia, Caucasus, and Central Asia at the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development. And Mitchfield Bostover, Director of Renewable Research and Innovation, Energy Efficiency in European Commission. Thank you for joining us here in this discussion. Maybe I will start with Jason. Coming from the public traded company, knowing that earlier there was difficulties and with regard to financing a renewable project. So today, what is the tune amongst your client investor with regard to investing in the renewable energy sector?
Well, just let me start by saying thank you. It is a great honor to be here. This is my first time in the Middle East. It's been a wonderful experience. I'm certain that I've learned far more here than I am going to dispense in knowledge today. But so many of these discussions involve improving the human condition, bringing power to regions that are experiencing, I guess, power poverty or cleaning up pollution or stopping climate change. It's almost seems vulgar to bring it down to the level of profitability. Nevertheless, attracting capital to do all these great things, at the end of the day, most of our investors are going to require a decent return. And it's interesting in the U.S. at least, as I deal with investors that are expressing more interest now in renewables investment than I've seen in the last probably 7 or 8 years. There's obviously an incredible amount of growth in the sector, but profitability has been almost uncorrelated to growth in the sector. When you look at Bloomberg has a nice index of about 100 publicly traded companies that they rank by purity of exposure to clean energy development. Basically 2012 through 2014, those companies were deeply unprofitable. And that index is still down, even if it's up 40% this year, it's still down about 60% from 2011. So you've got a lot of losses on the books, investors that maybe some that are looking to average in at lower prices who still believe in it, which is not a bad idea. But my wife was a neuroscience major, and she once told me that painful memories are 20 times more powerful than positive memories. And so when you're dealing with investors, sometimes that's a difficult dynamic to break them out of their recent pain and get them to look forward, right? It's not about undoing those losses. It's, okay, what do you do now? And for the first time, well, not the first time, but I would say since about mid-2015, we have seen profits in the public sector stabilize in the positive territory. Now, not great, margins aren't huge, but they're above zero and they're holding there. And selling prices for the companies that are manufacturers in this industry those selling prices have begun to level out. And it's hard to make money when the price of your goods are dropping by 60%, 80% over a 5-year time frame, and that's kind of what was happening. So these losses were good for growth of the sector, but they were really hard on investors. And so bringing investor capital back, at least through the public markets, is just taking some time to sort of make the arguments and get them to take a fresh look.
So do you think that the transition from fossil-fueled generation to renewable will still be on the fossil-fuel generated side, or that is moving on?
That's also a really important message to get across to clients. Renewables, for many people, is an emotional issue. It's a very politically charged issue. And I think the false dichotomy that those in favor of renewables want to put out there is that the rise of renewables equals the death of fossil fuels. And that is absolutely not the case. Just look at China, for example. I was mentioning there's a city in eastern China that has put into service more electric buses than the total buses being used in the 5 largest cities in America. Something like 15,000 electric buses they're employing in this one city in China. Yet China is setting records for growth in demand for crude oil. And this is not a zero-sum game. All of these energy resources are going to be required to supply the world with what they need to continue to grow and improve the economic conditions. And I think that once people get that, then I think it's a better path forward for investment.
Dr. Urban, with regard to the investment risk for the energy, I believe that the Energy Charter have an initiative with this regard. So what are you looking for with this new initiative that you are
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. So it's not the first time I'm being here in Abu Dhabi or with the Atlantic Council, but it's always a big privilege and honor to be with you. So first of all, I think that it's important to understand that Energy Charter is an intergovernmental organization. So we work mostly with the government, but for benefits of investors. The project, the initiative you have been referring to is called Energy Investment Risk Assessment. So we have the first non-public edition of it done for the 2017, covering only 9 countries, but from the different continents, trying to test the methodology, to benchmark. And what we are focusing on is very simple. If you are looking at the risk investment, you could distinguish 3 main baskets of risks. One are natural risks. The government has nothing to do normally with whether you have resources or you don't have resources. So are you blessed by God or not? If you don't have oil and gas or sun, you cannot exploit it. So it's clear. It's out of the reach of the government. The second important basket are prices. Well, again, so we have seen the prices are very volatile, and even there is a very different approaches to the prices. Some countries are subsidizing, some countries not. Still, the prices are not very much under the control of a very single government. So you could make a taxation, you could make an air force, but in global trends are beyond the reach of any individual governments. So what is left? Left is basically the energy governance. And what we are focusing in our project is to measure what kind of methodology is used by the government, how they imply the rule of the law, how they treat the investors, what are the institutions, how robust those institutions are, and how they are working. And basically this project is focused on measuring the risks associated with the governance, with the governance-related risks. So I would like to scale up this publication in 2018 for something like between 20 and 30 countries, and to show it as a public edition to show the countries and to the government that there is a way how to measure and continually measure, so to year, the performance of the governance regarding to the energy sectors, and how to help the spread of the good practices and the lessons learned to diminish actually this sector of risks related to the governmental decision and to the regulation.
So, going to from the risk to the barriers, what do you think the possible barriers for renewable within the region, and how to overcome this barriers? Is it only a financial barriers that will be controlled by risk allocation, or there is other barrier within the countries you are?
Well, I think that especially for the region, so this is not an issue of at this moment of development, as we have heard from the report, that the penetration of the renewable is relatively low. There are huge plans, but the actual implementation is not so important regarding to the portfolio, to the market, and to the balance of the different resources. Of course, the countries tend to use the most affordable resources first. This is very natural. And then if there's a surplus, they try to invest on developing the new resources. What's actually happening here in your region? In a broader sense, if you have a more broader look, if you take the example from the different regions, for example, Europe was one of the regions where the renewable technology has been adopted in the first, by very different subsidized and very different support schemes. So we have seen that the biggest challenge here was to make sure that the industry investors should get the reassurances that the promises of today, when they are investing, will be kept in the tomorrow. So there will be not a sudden regulatory changes in the risk which will affect the revenues, which will create a situation when the investors are relatively affected by the changes of the policies, when the policies are changing in a way when the investors feel the unnecessary pain. Here, I think the right balance between the right to governance, on side of the governance, the sovereign governance has a right to governance, and the right of investors to be protected is on the balance. And this is exactly why Energy Charter Treaty was invented 25 years ago, to provide this balance, to provide this instrument to balance the public and private interest in energy investment.
Okay. Just with regard to the geobiotic and Asian supergrid initiative, I think this will have an impact on investment, and a huge investment will be required. I know that the Energy Charter is participating within this studies, and I don't know if this is going to be also expanded for a super grid, or is this will be limited only for the Northern Asia?
I think that this idea of generating the renewable energy from the least populated part of the world, and then to be transformed by the long-term transmission to the poles of the consumption is not a new one. So if we could remind ourselves, so that maybe a decade ago there was the plan of Desertec, which was planning to build a capacity in North Africa, then to connect it to the Europe. This project was abandoned, not only for the political instabilities in some of the North African countries. Some countries, as has been mentioned, Morocco, are developing quite well. But we have seen that regardless of the multiple connections between Europe and Africa, in some times there have been a flow from electricity from Europe to Africa, because the generation capacity which was installed in Europe during this boom, and it was supported by the public money, was so huge that it didn't work that renewable energy was transferred from Africa to Europe, but other ways around. So coming back to the Northeast Asia, GobiTech. So this is even more ambitious project because the distances are bigger, and of course the political situation is not easier. So we have been as Energy Charter involved in this project for quite some time. There's a main challenge to this particular project in Northeast Asia is the cost of generation. So generation in Mongolia, which was set as a main production area, the Gobi Desert, from this coming called GobiTech, is actually higher than generation in a neighboring part of China. So cost price, it doesn't work so far yet. And then there is a second issue, is the cost of the transmission for the electricity for such a long distance is a couple of thousand kilometers. We know that in China there is an industry initiative called GATECO, where they're working very hard to solve the technical and political problems around. As Energy Charter, we are also playing a role to create a level playing field for investors, to secure that it's not only about the generation, but because the transition and transit of energy through the different jurisdictions. So the Charter Treaty is important element of the equation, but I don't think that it is going to have a very fast development over there. So regarding to the region of Middle East, where we are right now, I think that here the main issue would be that we don't need to transport the electricity to such a long distances, so it makes the situation a little bit simpler. And there is not such a big distance between the generation areas, which are kind of sparsely populated area, because in many countries in the region, you could find a place where to install a large capacity of renewables. I think the challenge here is more climatical change, that the question of how those especially photovoltaics plants and in the combination with CSP would work with a high temperature. So how actually much electricity you could generate, and not to compare with the losses for the transportation to the even shorter distance. The question is whether we will go for the decentralized generation, or we'll go other way to create a big generation centers and then to transport electricity on a distance. I think this is the question here.
Aida, renewable is a sector where EBRD is making a major contribution. And I think you have achieved, as a European Bank, the very high and mega project with regard to renewable. And you have, of course, an approach, two-pronged approach with regard to financing. And it will be really interesting to know this and how you achieved with this approach the large-scale financing.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank the Atlantic Council for inviting me to speak at this event in such a beautiful hosting location as Abu Dhabi. And on the two-pronged approach of BRD, I can say that Jean-François mentioned the word institutionalization of renewables earlier. So I think for us, it's really taken to the heart of our business model. It's policy engagement, as we call it, institutionalization, together with investments into specific projects, small and large. We remember the days when 2007, we were extremely pleased to sign the first wind farm, especially that we had to turn down a solar project because it was so expensive. It was 10 times the conventional power. There was no way it was bankable at the time. So fast forward 10 years on, 2017, we are indeed financing over 1.3 gigawatt in renewables just last year. And we see that the model where we talk to the regulators, we talk to the governments, and we work together on building a sustainable, bankable, predictable regulatory environment. That model feeds into the investor sentiment, feeds into reassurances that the investors can get. What we see now is that the landscape is really changing. The costs are going down. The investors, the equity investors potentially are not generating the returns they might have expected. So in this context, the risk allocation between equity investors, banks, regulators, and the public, the general public, is of course changing as well. So the more emphasis on the regulatory predictability, bankability is becoming prominent. We have to ensure that the investors are not realizing the returns that they had, say, 3 years ago. At least they have the comfort and reassurance of facilitating regulatory environment. And that would include, this could include everything, anything. It could include tax breaks, land allocation, interconnections. So the government can really play a role here. This is not just about money. This is about how you induce people to invest. And our region is really very, very diverse. We work from Mongolia to Morocco. It's really different geographies, different regulatory setups, different governments, different climatic conditions. But everywhere we work, we see that if you start early, if you start with a proper, well thought through regulatory framework, it pays off at the end of the day. Case in point is Egypt, where we participated in financing of the largest solar plant in Africa, and 750 megawatt came as a result of 3 years of the bank's work with the regulators, with the government, to get it right, to get it so that the investors are reassured and things are built and clean power is generated. And this is especially important as we feel the urgency of the climate change. We know that our governments all have their NDCs, they have the targets to meet, and this is where the joint effort on regulatory front would help everybody.
Coming to the government, with countries with natural fossil fuel endowment, definitely there is that might be an opposition with regard to the renewable and moving to renewable, especially with the affordability constraint, the job security, and other consideration. Of course, I'm not talking about UAE because we have decided in our energy strategy to be 50% clean, 50% fossil fuel. But how do you think that the possible way to overcome this?
It's a great question, and really some of the countries that the bank operates in, they have very big fossil fuel endowment, and at the first glance there may not be a natural connection of why they should be doing renewables at all, though maybe that argument is fading as the costs are coming down. But what we also see is we see political will. That's how things start. We see NDCs. We see governments understanding the imperative of climate change mitigation and that the renewables are a driving force of this mitigation. Countries signing up to the Paris Agreement. So this is something that helps in countries where 80% of generation is coal-fired powered. We're not even talking gas. And by the way, gas could be a good balancing power for renewables. So, and it's certainly less carbon intensive than coal. So even in those countries, there is, case in point is Kazakhstan. 80% of currently generation is coal-fired, and it's predominantly lignite coal. But the government made a conscious decision to diversify into renewables, take the full potential of what the full potential that Kazakhstan can offer, and start with a regulatory framework. I think it's a question of political will. There is, of course, the issue of affordability and how generally the population will take it. But what we see is that when people start understanding that carbon costs are not always factored in to what people are paying, and there are things associated. I mean, look at Beijing, probably pollution, or some cities in Kazakhstan. Things have to be addressed to change the environment, to change both local pollutants and the carbon emissions. So once those things are factored in, general population is becoming more receptive to cleaner energy.
Okay. Michel, coming from the European Union and having the European Union target with regard to renewable, with regard to investment in the research of clean energy, what are the key indicators to measure that success? You have in 2020 a target for the investment, and it's good to know what is the status of those targets to show the success in such investment.
Yeah, thank you very much also from my side for inviting me here. It's the first time I'm in Abu Dhabi, and I'm really delighted to be here. So thank you very much. I think we just heard how important the regulatory framework is, and that's why in the European Union we set out already in 2008 a regulatory framework with a minimum target of 20% renewables in energy at EU level, 20% energy efficiency, and minus 20% of CO2 emissions. And now in 2018, we are sure we will certainly reach the renewables target, the energy efficiency target, and overshoot the greenhouse gas emission target. For renewables, in addition, we have set national targets. So all the 28 member states have national targets. And here also, there's a huge difference, and I think that is also clear from the report. If we do regional report, there are obviously very much differences. In the EU, we have member states with 6-7% of renewables, Luxembourg, Malta, the smaller ones where there is not a lot of possibility. Then we have Sweden, which has over 50% of renewables, and then Germany, Denmark, France, with relatively high share. All of them will reach the 20% target for the EU. Some of them are still a little bit below, but most are there. So the regulatory framework, because of the 2020 success, I would say, and I come back to that, we have also set targets for 2030. So we now move for renewables to minimum 27%, maybe more. We are just now discussing that. 27 or 30% renewables energy efficiency, and minus 40% CO2 emissions. So we will continue with an ambitious framework, but we saw how important this framework is to get the investments. We have calculated more than 379 billion euros investment every year from 2020 to 2030 to reach our ambitious targets. So there is a huge possibility for investments, public, but certainly mostly private investment needed. We accompany that, what we just put on the table, which we call a clean energy package, which has the renewables directive, renewables framework, energy efficiency, but also the electricity market design, because we need to adapt our markets, be more flexible on demand and supply side, and what we call a governance. So all member states have to make their energy and climate plans to 2030. They have to tell us how much renewables, how much energy efficiency, how much all others, nuclear, gas, oil, they want to go for in 2030. So this is in line with the NDCs, obviously. And then we from the Commission monitor every year, every 2 years, how the progress is made. So I think one thing is the regulatory framework with targets. The other thing is the monitoring.
I think interesting, the market, the energy market design is really, and I believe this is a smart way also, because people start, in some cases, getting the excuse of curtailment, other thing. So design the right market is really important. Now, as you mentioned, achieving the renewable, there is also, to achieve that target, we need to spend on energy efficiency. So what framework do you see will have the biggest impact on the energy efficiency sector in the future?
So for us, renewables policy and energy efficiency go hand in hand. They are not any contradiction. We go for more energy efficiency, renewables, but I would agree that they are obviously, not to forget, that each member state can choose. So there are many other resources also in Europe. The trend is to go for more renewables and for energy efficiency. For energy efficiency, we mainly concentrate on 3 sectors. Buildings, which are consuming half of our energy. Transport, where we have done a lot on the CO2 emissions for cars, and we will soon do something for lorries. And then industry, which has doing a very good job, I must say, on energy efficiency in Europe. Also the energy-intensive industries. They have done major innovation technologies, and it's a cost factor, obviously, for the energy-intensive. I think we are most advanced in Europe on the buildings side, where we have rather high requirements for new buildings. We call them from 2020 on zero-emission buildings. So all new buildings must be zero-emission buildings. And now, with the latest proposal, which is part of our framework, we are tackling the existing building stock. And in Europe, buildings are built for 50, 60, 70 years. So it's very hard to make a change there. So we have put in our framework that 1% of the building stock needs to be renovated every year, at least, obviously. And that needs to be accompanied, that's the regulatory framework, with finance. You mentioned the regulatory framework, but we do also a lot of finance, either public money, we have some funds there, be it from the investment funds, be it from the regional funds, or research funds, or infrastructure funds. So but it's only part of it. There are a lot of other possibility, national or private money, which is needed. But the sectors on energy efficiency, I think the key is building next to transport.
So for Ida and Jason, because you are the representing a financing institute, energy efficiency as a project, how you are dealing with those energy efficiency projects in your organizations. Plus, as I mentioned in the beginning, is that electrification is a solution to increase the utilization of renewable energy. So how is the process or the evaluation process for electrification project, for transport, for even for industry, as Mr. Tel mentioned? So, Ida and Jason.
All right, okay. Well, start on the energy efficiency front. This is at the heart of EBRD. I mean, energy efficiency predates everything we're doing currently on renewables. So this goes long time back. And now it's sort of enveloped into what we call green economy transition, where every year the amount of green investments, proper green investments, should be no less than 40% of the bank's business for that year. We see energy efficiency obviously not just in generation and power, although this is the largest source of carbon emission reductions. This feeds into carbon emissions reduction. We see it across all of operations and across all of our sectors. So there has to be, certainly the negative energy efficiency would not be on the bank's agenda. Every single project, be it renewables or any other, would drive energy efficient, would have to meet energy efficiency requirements. We have certain certain metrics for each specific facility, not just in generation, but in transportation of energy, in distribution of electricity, losses reductions, and similar things that all drive energy efficiency. One of the parts that sort of interrelated, I was speaking of different sectors, on transport and electrification that you mentioned, Fatima. I think there the only probably consideration we would like to make for our countries is that the source of electricity for those things would have to be obviously renewables. It might be very obvious here, for example. It's not necessarily very obvious in some of the countries that are fossil fuel rich. So it's really a big consideration for them not to be sort of promulgating, say, coal generation, for example, to feed the transport to switch to the electrification of transport sector. So this is something that is still early days and something that we're really looking very closely at and thinking about.
Jason?
Yeah, it's so many different thoughts come to mind. It's frustrating. It's a frustrating topic from the public investment side. I think that to be honest, the future of the development and the implementation of renewables is probably going to be dominated by the private investment side. You know, failures tend to get a lot more attention than successes, and when you've had some sort of inexperienced Silicon Valley personalities running out there to try to jump into this fast-growing sector, and you saw some undisciplined deployment of capital, excessive use of leverage, and some high-profile failures. People, I think, are starting to realize that this is a new technology, but it's probably much better used in the hands of experienced utility companies, large energy companies who are very experienced in assessing long-term returns on investment and in executing, of course, right? Even if you've got the population density, even if you've got a plan that could work in the real world, you need to have project management that can execute well, deliver on time, and deliver within budgets. All those types of things, like experienced operators. So I think that's driving it towards private investment. Now, maybe at some point that will, it will grow to the point where you can spin these out. But it just seems to work much better in the hands of experienced private operators. So, it's hard to say from the public investment side where things are going to go. So, but I think that as the space grows, that problem will gradually solve itself. The problem you have with the public markets is that you have a deal that's initially struck by people that I think are experienced and sort of shrewd evaluators. But then once you go public, you're reselling that deal at a higher price to people. And then, of course, the pricing gets out of your hands as well. And people that aren't informed may end up paying too high a price. And then when prices come back to earth, it sort of hurts sentiment for investment in that space. So again, just sort of the psychology of all of that. And we're kind of seeing that in the U.S. shale business right now, where you had the wrong incentives in the hands of management. Return on equity was not driving their decisions. Production volumes are driving their decisions, and you end up getting distortions in the market. Now that finally investors are imposing discipline on those operators, it's kind of incredible the slowdown you're seeing in growth and activity in that sector, which is good for the stability of the market long term. But it was a painful process until investors were finally burned hard enough to come in there and sort of force discipline on operators that maybe weren't incentivized in the right way. So, these things, when you have new markets, you sort of have these hiccups as they develop. And I had an uncle who was a real estate developer in Southwest United States back in the 80s and 90s, and he said, it's always the second or third owner that makes the money on these projects. The first one always goes under. So, don't ever get in at the beginning. You've seen a little bit of this right here, and as the market matures, that will improve, and I think that you'll see consolidation into the hands of the experienced, proven operators, and then that'll just help with the momentum from a public investment side, I think.
Thank you. Now we'll open the room for any questions, if you have.
There are many old buildings from the 20th century, and they were all built to, I would say, significant substandard in terms of insulation. And I've seen a lot of energy waste in the UAE, not only in building insulation, but also in AC control or AC air conditioning efficiency. I've seen it in my old house versus my new house. I almost cut 50% of the AC bill. What suggestions would you have to the UAE in terms of regulation or incentives to renovate old buildings, or encourage either owners or by regulation or by incentives to improve the efficiency, because you could get the equivalent of a full new power plant just by improving the efficiency of building insulation or control.
So, I mean, it's a good example. It's not only in the UAE. We have in Europe, everywhere, old houses which are not very well insulated. That's why our focus is now on the building stock and the renovation of the building stock. So we are just finalizing a new directive, a new framework for energy efficiency in buildings, where we set the target for member states, all governments, to have at least 1% of their building renovated every year. But we also put in more the link to digitalization, so the need for smart meters, smart homes, also in the renovation, that they do apply more smarter digitalized systems to control it. And then we put a lot of finance, what we call smart finance for smart buildings, to encourage. So we work with public banks, EIB, EBRD, then national banks, KfW in Germany, but many others, who give to private people or to other more bigger places, office buildings, money, incentives to renovate the house. So there is a very strict framework, a lot of obligation, also for inspection and so on. But what we see in Europe, at least, when we had that discussion now for the last year on the new Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, there's a huge interest from industry, Siemens, Bosch, but also smaller ones, Schneider Electric, a lot of Vestas, Danfoss. I don't know if they're known here, they are right here, but they heavily invest, and the chemical industry as well, because it's a lot about industry. So we have the backing also of the industry to go for more, and the backing of the governments, and that will now make the change over years. It won't happen overnight, obviously, because not everyone can get the loan and the money to do it, but the payback time is getting shorter. So as you say, I mean, if you do it now, before it was in 15 years, and maybe as an owner, and then it's the relation between owner and tenant always. As an owner, you're more inclined as for the tenant. But we have a lot of good example in Europe where the payback time has been much, much shorter now, and the introduction of digital appliances, I think, and the financial.
Dr. Alban, you have something to add?
Yes, I would like to add a few words also on this big topic, which was just slightly touched upon, and this is this demand side energy cycle. So because and especially during this Atlantic Council meeting, so we have been so much focused on the generation, on the supply side. So we're always discussing all kind of energy, nuclear, oil, fossil, renewables, etc., etc. But so little attention do we pay for on a demand side management. This is the key question you have been asking for. So how to set the right incentives for the demand side management, how to actually decrease the energy consumption, not necessarily to create a demand to be fit again by the new cycle, new generation, etc., so to continue this cycle. I think there is and Europe, and from our constituency, there is a very good examples from Europe, but also from Japan. I mean, what has to be done? I mean, it's very simple and very complex on the same time. So you have to first to have a very strong policy. So to see what we are looking for. As was just mentioned by European Commission, European Union, and its 28 member states, they are setting the policy target. Then you need to have a performance standards. This is starting point. So if you don't have performance standards, then you could not achieve, and to enforce them publicly. And labeling. I mean, this is very important. So if you go across the European Union, you see all public buildings have the labels. Even if you are looking for the advertisement of the selling and buying the house or renting house, you will see the owners has an obligation to make on their own cost the energy efficiency audit and to tell the tenant, well, this house has this energy efficiency. So, and this is kind of creating a pressure, a public pressure on increasing, on improving the standards. While there is no shortcut here, just to set standards and to enforce them. But in the long term, according to the IEA predictions, all this demand cycle package, so it's expected to have a increase investment in 20-fold between today and 2040. So if the generation side, supply side of energy is predicted to be more or less stable, but redistribution among the different sort of energy for generation, that big investment opportunity in longer term, this is the demand side. So what kind of technology, what kind of energy efficiency standard, how to implement it in all the key sectors like transport, building, and industry, I mean, this is a key question for the future. So I believe that, of course, we need to maintain our generation capability, to have the flexibility, but to start to think seriously about the demand side, this demand side of management of our big energy sectors. Thank you.
So we'll have His Excellency Dr. Mutar Niadi, the Undersecretary for Ministry of Energy and Industry, to add on this subject as this is related to the ministry.
Thank you. I just need to shed light about the question of the UAE. Retrofitting an energy service company, they are already exist in the UAE. Retrofitting building as an initiative from the federal government perspective is already in place. The federal government identified 3,000 buildings owned by the government, by the federal government, and the Ministry of Energy is working to provide to start retrofitting that federal government. So the government start to lead by example, incentivize the people to start retrofitting the old building. It's not easy, but the opportunity is there. What will help for that opportunity is already we have a NISCO company. We have a number of companies within the UAE and a successful company that is helping the owner to retrofitting the building and providing the initial cost, and the payback period, as rightly identified, is becoming now shorter. The pilot study that the ministry has identified is we're talking about 5 years' time for schools and mosques and malls and hospitals. This is the building which attracts that will be the initial project for retrofitting. We believe efficiency will help to reduce the demand in the UAE, especially with the AC. So there is a huge work that we look in down the road. The work is already started, and we are optimistic in that. So rest assured, the project is undergoing. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. We'll have one question.
Hello, Tahir Gozal from Azerbaijan. My question is about the technology curve, about the new solar panels. Has it matured, or how is it going in terms of increasing the potential of profitability? Let's say in a country like Azerbaijan, I've heard from one of the panels, they said that in the next 2-3 years, it will be 50% more cost cuts. Then is it not better for somebody like in Azerbaijan to wait 1 or 2 years where it actually becomes profitable without the subsidies to invest in this kind of things? What would you say on this subject? Yes.
For Jason?
I could start. So in many regions of the world, and this is changing so quickly, right? So what I said 2 years ago wouldn't be true today, and what I say today may not be true in 2 years. So take it for yourself. But solar and even wind, but especially solar in certain areas of the world on an unsubsidized basis is the cheapest option. And there are also other things that come into play as well. So when you look at coal or gas or even nuclear in the current technology form, consumes a great deal of water, right, to either run the steam turbines or for cooling purposes. And so if you're in a region where you have a big water scarcity issue, then the decision becomes very easy. Even if solar efficiency in the panels and the is going to go up by a factor 2 years from now, but if you need to add power now, solar could still be the best option today. So.
Aida, you have.
Just to add that on the timing, I think this is the golden moment for the governments to take the full advantage of the competitive tender scheme, to get the prices that we see in so many countries and the results of those prices and the cost efficiency. There was one aspect that governments are looking increasingly is the stability of the grid and reinforcement of the grid and the costs, and question who is going to be bearing those costs. So in terms of technology and how it progresses, I think storage, batteries as the next sort of stage would be driving the agenda for the governments. As to generation, proper solar, indeed, I mean, if you just look up on the how low prices can go, it's a great opportunity. And that's why countries that are not naturally predisposed to renewables, including probably Azerbaijan, are looking at developing the framework and taking the advantage of their potential.
Now I will invite David Livingston, Deputy Director, Climate and Advanced Energy in the Atlantic Council, to give the closing remark for this session.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Thank you, Jean-Francois, for your very interesting presentation. And thanks to all of our panelists for a superb and fascinating discussion on this interesting issue area. My name is David Livingston. As mentioned, I'm a Deputy Director in the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center, where I lead our work on advanced energy and climate change. 2017 was the 8th successive year in which investment in clean energy exceeded $250 billion. And it also saw a number of auctions in which a wave of record-setting bids for renewable energy were realized around the world. Most notable, of course, was in Saudi Arabia, where an auction saw a bid below 2 cents per kilowatt hour offered by Abu Dhabi's own Masdar, a consortium led by Masdar, which was the first time in history that 2 cent threshold had been breached. We're also seeing, as this panel noted, rapid innovation in the business models, the financial mechanisms, and in the investment products and vehicles that are driving capital into this energy transformation that Adnan Amin of IRENA laid out so articulately yesterday. So too is the rise of renewable energy and the trend of electrification, changing the geopolitics of energy in interesting and oftentimes in unpredictable and nonlinear ways. It's for this reason that the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center is investing in a new wave of scholarship, a new wave of relationships, connections, convenings, and capabilities that will allow us to be leaders in setting the agenda when it comes to advanced energy, when it comes to electrification, and when it comes to the increasing balance and the increasing set of options that we see entering the energy sector today. And so, as the advanced energy sector moves from venture capital to larger and larger pools of institutional capital, as we see investment flows that once went from the west to the east, now emanate in the east and go to the west, go to the global south, and go to the east as well as all over the world. As we see new technologies, new standards, new market trends develop, the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center will be there with reports just like Jean-Francois's to understand, to interpret, to articulate what these new trends mean, and how emerging players such as Abu Dhabi and the entire region here are going to be playing larger and larger roles going into the future. And so I'd like to thank this wonderful panel and thank you in the audience for joining us If you're interested in these themes and you want to continue the conversation, I would encourage you to walk upstairs after a brief 15-minute coffee break right now, up to the Almaria room, the auditorium up there. There will be the next panel, the electrification of everything. Dr. Fatih Birol of the IEA will be giving a keynote speech, and it will be followed by a superb panel of leaders from both the public and private sector. So I'd encourage you to go up there. That will be starting shortly, like I said, after just a 15-minute coffee break. And I'd like to thank you all again for taking the time to sit with us today and to engage in such an interesting and important and timely conversation. Thank you.